Was it July 4th, Independence Day last year, that you decided, let me go independent with Foresight? So where did that foresight come from?
I've been serving advisors, like we said, for close to 27 years. And I spent a good 9 or 10 years helping RIAs form, right? And coming out of the wirehouses, coming out of the captive models and starting these businesses. And so I used to always joke about when we'd have a date, that's your Independence Day.
Leaders like Peter Mallouk have called for a seismic shift, right? From a seller's market to a buyer's market. I think you yourself have said that advisors who are kind of waiting without a plan, it's like procrastination with a business plan attached or something along those lines. What is the M&A market like right now? And, if I'm an advisor looking for something, how should I be thinking about it?
The general mood of M&A is it's very frothy right now. There's a lot of activity, especially towards the larger end where people are starting to get excited about larger deals. But really that's a reflection, in my opinion, of demographics from a business perspective. RIAs have been charging 1% a year for the last 27 years that I've been in the business. Is people interested now? A lot of it has to do with kind of supply and demand. The numbers we see out there is roughly 15,000, over 100 million out there. I think those are numbers you and I have looked at.
Yeah, that's right.
And you look at some of the average ages of the demographic, and they have a challenge in front of them. The question that's not really being discussed a lot in the press is, what is this doing to the future of the industry? There's just a lot going on right now. I like to play the role of the Sherpa, right? I've been up and down the mountain a ton of times. Let me help you kind of watch where to step, where not to step.
Climbing that mountain isn't necessarily the advisor's expertise. They do need a Sherpa, right? We have talked about this a lot, whether that's someone going independent or whether it's an M&A integration or a tuck-in. Everyone seems to hit that wall, right? Actually moving the book of business. And you've called it like it's brutal, right? Why is it brutal? What is brutal?
It's interesting. And obviously you guys are doing a ton of great work, and I'm very interested in what you guys have built and what you're working with your clients on. And I think you guys are the tip of the spear and heading in that particular direction. So many moving parts, right? And we're in a very highly regulated industry.
Welcome to Advisor Ally. How are you doing?
Excellent, my friend. How are you doing?
Good. We've been talking for a long time, and we've had a lot of fun conversations, and we've always talked about actually doing an episode together. I know it only took us a few months, but I'm glad we're here now.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me on. And I've really enjoyed our relationship since we serendipitously met each other. I think it was October of last year, somewhere around that time. But really have enjoyed the conversations over the months.
Absolutely. I think soon after you'd started Foresight, and actually that's kind of where I'd love to start. You've been in this industry 25 years now, Andy?
Yeah, I think approaching 27. I'm in finance, so math is not my strong suit. Just joking around. But I think I fell into this business in like middle to late 99, I want to say, is when I started fresh out of college. Didn't know anything about the industry and just luckily got a job in the industry.
Just around the .com boom, or just before that, I guess.
Yeah.
But, so you've seen the industry from all the angles that you can think of. And I think, was it July 4th, Independence Day last year, that you decided, let me go independent with Foresight? So where did that foresight come from?
Yeah.
Was it a single moment?
It's a little on the nose, I think, starting your firm on Independence Day, but it's kind of been a running joke for me. I've been serving advisors, like we said, for close to 27 years, and I spent a good 9 or 10 years helping RIAs form, right? And coming out of the wirehouses, coming out of the captive models and starting these businesses. And so I used to always joke about, when we'd have a date, that's your Independence Day, right? And so, when I finally bit the bullet for myself, the timing just happened to work out well. My last gig was ending at the end of May, and I saw this July 4th date out there, and I was like, what a perfect day to launch Foresight.
I think, was it July 4th, Independence Day last year, that you decided, let me go independent with Foresight? So where did that foresight come from?
My friends have known, I've probably been talking about it for the last 10 or 15 years. In one way, shape, or the other. That's
great. I think everyone needs to finally pull the plug or, bite the bullet, like you said. And we're approaching close to a year now. Time has flown, right? oftentimes you've mentioned that the kind of, and you're working with a lot of RIAs, obviously. You keep saying, right, RIA owners come to you with the wildest questions. Why am I still up at 11 p.m. doing billing?
Yeah.
Or will my expensive tech stack finally work? I find that very, very interesting. But from a macro standpoint, and we'll get into how you deal with some of that at Foresight. But what does that kind of say about the industry, though? Like some of these patterns
Yeah,
that
I
they're seeing?
think, well, I always feel like, we talk about this industry being in transition. I think it's in a constant transition, right? And what's kind of the current flavor? When we got into the business, or when I got into the business, the RIAs were frankly smaller. We were just as excited about an $80 million firm as we were, a couple hundred. And you could probably count on one hand the number of firms that were close to $1 billion or over $1 billion. And then we had the breakaway movement, right? We had that start kind of in the early 2000s. And then you had the '08 through 10. And so this industry is always kind of reinventing itself and having a lot of different movement. And that's what, frankly, I love about it. It kind of plays to my ADHD brain, is that I need to have a lot of the different exciting things going on, right now. And, obviously, when you're in a growing industry, right, that's growing both organically and inorganically, more so today than ever, that just leaves a lot of room for innovation, a lot of interesting things. And the challenges that my clients and other RIAs are facing is it's a whole lot to digest, right? You really need an advisor to advisors. You need a guide to kind of help you, because every day there's something new coming at you in this industry. Whether it's technology, AI, new custodians, old custodians, new technology, just
Right.
change is a constant.
That's crazy. And also, I think the demographics of the advisors also, right, with so many people expected to potentially retire from the industry in the next 10, 15 years, means that if anything is only going to grow as it has in the last few years, right? It's a very good segue into that whole topic, which is kind of, very close to your heart as well. And I know, leaders like Peter Mallouk have called for a seismic shift, right, from a seller's market to a buyer's market. I think you yourself have said that advisors who are kind of waiting without a plan, it's like procrastination with a business plan attached or something along those lines. What is the M&A market like right now? And, if I'm an advisor looking for something, how should I be thinking about it?
Well, what's really interesting to me, since I went independent, the number of, third parties out there, not classic players in this space, that are reaching out to people like me to pick our brains and ask us, this very question. And I would say, that's interesting unto itself. We've seen it with some of the large, integrators and aggregators and large RIAs with private equity. But, there's still other private equity providers out there that are just starting to learn about this space, right? And so what I'd say the general mood of M&A is it's very frothy right now. There's a lot of activity, especially towards the larger end, where people are starting to get excited about larger deals. But really, that's a reflection, in my opinion, of demographics, more so than, from a business perspective. RIAs have been charging 1% a year for the last 27 years that I've been in the business. Why is people interested now? And I think a lot of it has to do with kind of supply and demand. I've seen that, I think it's the numbers we see out there is roughly 15,000, over 100 million out there. I think those are numbers you and I've looked at.
Yeah, that's right.
And you look at some of the average ages of that demographic, and they have a challenge in front of them. And that kind of leads me to something that I wanted to talk about with you is the question that's not really being discussed a lot in the press is, what is this doing to the future of the industry? This the consolidation of all these kind of, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but mom and pop RIAs, as far as like, hey, a single owner, selling to a large conglomerate. What happens to the second generation and the third generation? Are they going to have the same opportunities that the first generation did when they launched their RIAs? And so that's something that I've been thinking a lot about lately.
Yeah, I don't think that's spoken about enough, right? I think everyone's talking about the owner that's moving. And oftentimes there's like you said, a second generation advisor who's kind of stitched to the same deal without really, in some cases, maybe not wanting to participate to the fullest extent. But, what can they do about it? Like, is there a question they can ask? What's your kind of view?
Well, the thing that the example that I'm thinking about, and a lot of us who have worked in the industry a long time have seen this story play out multiple times, is that I don't think there's really bad intentions out there when it comes to the sellers and things like that. So when I kind of describe this, I hope you don't think of it as derogatory. It's really just a reality, is that there's been a lot of first generation advisors that have kind of held out the equity idea to G2, like, hey, you're going to help me build this and eventually you'll participate. And what happens, unfortunately, is a lot of times not due to any kind of maliciousness, but the can gets kicked down the road, right? On and on and on. And what's happening at the same time is, we've had this crazy bull market for a long time now. Values are going up. PEs coming into the space. Valuations of these RIAs are now becoming higher and higher. It creates a problem where that second generation who's kind of I don't want to say promised, because maybe nothing was put into writing, but it's certainly alluded to. And then they can't afford to buy them, and it's okay. I don't begrudge anyone the ability to sell their business at the top value, but it makes me kind of wonder, maybe I'm just an idealist, but I think about all those advisors that I helped launch those businesses and the difference of the mindset that they had then versus the mindset now. And, where do we go from here?
Interesting. So buying them out becomes a problem in a frothy, bullish market. That's very interesting. But what happens to them technically, Andy, the G2 advisors, they obviously move to the new firm alongside the owners. Does their lock-in towards equity there's another lock-in once they move in? How does that typically... Or is there no?
It's on the buyer, right? And there's some really good buyers out there that are thinking this way, right? And are creating.
Because you don't want to lose them also, right? Potentially.
Correct. I think, we talk about the breakaway movement. I've heard some people start talking about the second breakaway movement, of RIA type advisors leaving RIAs to start their own firm. I don't know if it's necessarily that. I think it's more of, approaching a talent war, right? Because there aren't enough people backfilling the previous generation, of advisors out there. And the firms that are going to win, and this kind of goes to your question about the buying firms, there's a lot of good firms out there that are buying these firms. I'm not trying to paint them all in a negative light or anything like that. They are doing things like providing for equity, providing leadership, providing career paths. But for that G2 who may have been as entrepreneurial as the founder, maybe just slightly short of it, didn't start their own business, hook their wagon to one. I think about those advisors a lot, because what I have always loved about the RIA industry is really the entrepreneurial mindset of it.
Yep.
When we got into the business, we were making up the rules as we were going along. The custodians were trying to figure it out. Spirit of this business that I worry about disappearing as things become more, scalable and corporate and things like that. Maybe that's just the rebel in me.
No, I think it's fair. But also I think, there's few people have mentioned that what you see as a consolidation wave then leads to another deconsolidation wave. It's always a cycle as well.
Yeah,
so maybe that will happen too.
It's almost like energy, right? Or the universe. And we see it in lots of different industries, right? And, one of the things that I see advisors, looking at and struggling with is, adding tax to your capabilities, tax planning, tax returns, because they're having trouble finding CPAs who want to do tax work, right? And so there's an example of an industry, that kind of maybe expanded and contracted a few times. I think we can look to some other industries, consulting industries, the big players, and now they're small players. There's history rhymes, doesn't repeat, right? And you start looking at that. And that's the goofy history major in me always thinks about the history of things.
Oh, no, but it makes sense. But coming back to the deal itself, right? So you've been on the hot seat in large firms, right? Mercer, NewEdge. etc. Everything looks like a good deal when it goes through. What is a good deal, and what might be the reason for a good deal to come undone?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So the way I've always done my business, I kind of joke, like I've been in sales roles for most of my career, but I don't think of myself as a salesperson. I think of myself really as a consultant, and I always have. And so, when I'm talking to a prospective seller, a prospective advisor in transition, whatever it is, that they're doing is really coming down to, are we solving a problem? Right. And so I've always modeled myself after the advisors I serve, right? And what do they do with their clients? Well, when they have a prospective client, they sit down and they do a ton of discovery. Where do you want to be? Where do you want to go? These are the same things that I do with my advisors. And to answer your question, what makes a good deal is the advisor who's self-aware enough and honest enough with themselves to help paint that picture. Right? I call it kind of the city on the hill, to steal from Reagan back in the 80s. What is this ideal that you're putting out there? And let's paint that picture, right? Let's strip away all the things that people have told you no before. And then let's back into this solution once we have the ideal in mind. And again, it's very much like financial planning with their clients. What do you need to retire? What do you need to do this? I'm doing very much the same thing. And the clearer that picture, the better the deal is going to be, because when it comes time for this word in this paragraph of this legal document that somebody gets wrapped around the axle on, or oh my gosh, you use this financial planning and I use that financial planning, right?
Right.
Like there's going to be little hiccups through the way, but if you have this clear vision of where you're going, it's easier to get past these roadblocks, right? And it's easier to avoid the emotion that comes with little disappointments along the way, because nobody's perfect.
Right. I guess so. So obviously, the thing that attracts, or the first or the biggest thing that attracts anyone to a deal is the number.
Yeah.
What am I getting out of it? But there's a lot more to the number and beyond the number is kind of what you're saying, right? What would you, like from your experience, Andy, what are some of these other questions that they should be asking, right? Like in terms of what are the non-negotiables? There's always, hey, I use this tool, you use that tool, I'll make my peace with it. But what are those non-negotiables, right? Which advisors should be aware of?
So, and I hope this doesn't sound cliche, but, at the end of the day, they're fiduciaries, right? And so when I talk about, the sale of their business, what I try to do is break it up into 3 buckets for them. Is this good for their clients, right? And ultimately, that's the non-tangible, that's the thing that you really need to understand as a fiduciary advisor before you sell. What is the lift? How do my clients benefit from this? The good news is most every buyer that I know out there is very good at demonstrating that to you and explaining that to you. And in theory, with that scale, they should naturally be able to deliver more resources to your clients. And an argument could be made that that's better for them. The second one is really the staff. And this kind of touches on what I was talking about earlier. Does this create opportunity for the people that helped you get to where you are today? You likely didn't do it 100% on your own. And you want to make sure that whatever you're doing, one, because it's instrumental to the success of the transition, right, is to have everyone rowing in the same direction. So don't get me wrong, there's a vested interest in this as well. But how does this help my employees achieve their goals, right? And what they're trying to do? I may have a CSM, a client service manager who's been working with me for years that really should probably be an advisor by now, right? They have all the skill set, but we didn't have the scale to provide that opportunity to them, right? That's a nice little benefit. And then to hit on what you're hitting on, the third is joke. It's actually the easiest. It's like, is this good for you? Right? Is the dollar amount that's shown to you, really what helps you achieve your goal and what you wanted to set out to do with this business? And I kind of look at that as really like a binary yes, no, where the other ones are kind of nuanced and
subjective,
those lines. And so, as a seller, as you're kind of going through this emotionally fraught transaction, right? This is something that you need to create yourself a framework for making these decisions. And that's why I usually start with that. Just like I did earlier with the view of the sea. It's like, if you have this framework for thinking about it, it'll make it easy. And then stop reading numbers in the press, right? Like stop pulling multiples out. Always the first question when someone goes, well, I heard this person got this multiple. It's like, well, multiple of what, right? And you can kind of see where people are, because they'll be like, it's almost like they're asking you the question when they're answering, like revenue. And I'm like, try again. I go, no, it wasn't revenue. It wasn't top line revenue. Let's keep talking.
Yep.
And then, this multiple game, anyone who's kind of seen these deals from the inside understand that there's a lot of work that goes into these P&Ls to get to these EBITDA numbers. And it's really a distraction looking at somebody else's multiple. It only matters in the eye of the beholder, the buyer.
Yep. It doesn't serve you. Yeah. I mean, I can see why it's so tempting to kind of be driven by that and what you see. I mean, it's human nature, right? We're all kind of.
Yeah, I love looking up my house value on Zillow every now and then. It doesn't matter unless I'm going to sell it today.
Exactly.
So it's always.
But I love the framework, Andy. I think the way you've put that together, because essentially what you're saying is, does it make sense for everyone who's involved in the deal and everyone that's been part of you growing this business? And it should really start from where this business has come from, your clients, then the people who have been in the journey with you, and then of course you. So, and I love it. I think that's a very neat and simple way, as you said, to look at it. And actually, on that note, your model, the way you operate at Foresight is you're paid by the advisor or the RIA, right? And I
set out to do something a little bit different. I think
that's not the model, right? The industry.
It's not a normal model, So Foresight and what I do, one of my biggest challenges is that there's never been a problem that I've seen that I haven't really wanted to dive in and try to help, right? Especially when it comes to advisors. And so when I created Foresight, my concept was, and I alluded to this earlier, is that, I've been working with these registered investment advisors pretty much for my entire career. And I fell in love with this concept of a fiduciary relationship where, where my conflicts of interests are. I have to disclose them to you. I have to avoid them as a fiduciary advisor. I approached Foresight in much the same way. One, I wanted to create a model where I could serve advisors at a price point where I could have a book of clients that I charged a fair price to, that I could interact on a monthly basis and enjoy. I knew I'd be pulled into transactions, right? Because that's the world I lived in. Whether that transaction is somebody leaving a wirehouse or a captive model towards the RIA space, moving, just any advisor in transition, moving between, platforms. In those classic models, a lot of it, that compensation comes from the people receiving the advisor. And I'm not saying that's a terrible model for everyone, but for me, what I wanted was, I said, hey, I would rather take a fraction of what that payment might be so that my conscience would be clear. And so why don't we set up a direct payment relationship? Or perhaps we get to a point where you make the decision, kind of like if a client came to an advisor who doesn't really believe in annuities or something along those lines, but is just demanding it. Right? Well, hey, I'm going to help my client one way or another. I'm going to disclose how I feel about those, where I think the conflict of interest is. But ultimately, it's my client's decision, right? What to do with their money. I want to do the same thing for the advisors I work with, regardless of where they go for their home. And so that's a little bit different. I don't do as high quantity as others out there because I also do the consulting business. And then the other aspect of Foresight really is working with RIA platform. I've got a few of those clients working on sales methodology, coaching of their teams, helping M&A programs, right? For these firms. And that's one of the things you asked about earlier. One of the things I'm seeing out there it's like the old days. Everybody and their mother wants to be in M&A and buy. You get phone calls from people that are much more experienced or, maybe towards the end of their career saying, I want to buy a younger advisor. And I'm like, that doesn't make sense. It's usually the other way around, right? Kind of thing. So it's going back to my frothy comment. There's just a lot going on right now. And it's a good time. A shameless plug is I like to play the role of the Sherpa, right? I've been up and down the mountain a ton of times. Let me help you kind of watch where to step, where not to step.
No, and it's fair, right? I think climbing that mountain isn't necessarily the advisor's expertise. They do need a Sherpa, right? It's totally understandable. Into the move itself, I know we have talked about this a lot, whether it's someone going independent or whether it's an M&A integration or a tuck-in. Everyone seems to hit that wall, right? Actually moving the book of business. And you've called it like it's brutal, right? Why is it brutal? What is brutal about it?
Well, it's interesting. And obviously you guys are doing a ton of great work. And I'm very interested in what you guys have built and what you're working with your clients on. And I think you guys are the tip of the spear and heading in that particular direction. Over the last 27 years, I've seen custodians flail at this. I've seen large RIAs, small RIAs. There's just so many moving parts, right? And we're in a very highly regulated industry, right? And, having worked for both Schwab and Fidelity in the past, I used to joke, I said, one would tell me this is a rule and the other one would tell me this rule, and they'd be different from each other because there's a lot of nuance to the business. It's not like one was right, one was wrong. Their interpretation or their policy was different, right? And this is just a small example of all of the pieces that come into play. Then on top of all this regulation, various types of paperwork, different paperwork from custodian to custodian, you add in the human element, right? You add in clients who might be older, right? Who might have different levels of tech capabilities, who might be on the fence, right? And so it's a very emotional time as these advisors are going out there and getting this. And so having a good technology provider, having a good project manager, there's third-party consultants out there, that it's not so much of the moving of the paperwork. Technology can help with that, but somebody to project manage and guide all of these moving parts. As advisors, you have your day job at the same time that you're doing all this. And this is why it usually takes an army, right, to do this, getting back to your question. And, it's shocking to me up until the moment we met and we started talking, why hasn't technology addressed this?
Right. It was shocking to us as well. And to your point, I think it's not a very easy problem to solve for because of the various combinations and nuances. But it's been an exciting journey for us also to kind of dive deeper into the problem statement and see what can actually help folks. But, from your experience, everyone seems to hit this brick wall. You talked about project management, preparing your staff. Is it because not enough people give importance to this bit, or they're just not aware until it hits them? Why is it that?
Yeah, it's a great question. This is more opinion than fact. I think everyone knows it's kind of messy, right? It's kind of like the elephant in the room, right? It's one of those things where, I had an old boss who used to joke with me. He'd say, don't take that on. You're assigning yourself 100 push-ups into the future, right? Somewhere in the future, you have to do 100 push-ups. Well, that's kind of what, I think a lot of these player advisors and players, they know it's out there, maybe sometimes ignorance is bliss, to a degree. But here's the thing. The industry is made up of some amazing people doing these transitions. Every firm I've ever worked for, has had really amazing, good people that do these transitions, whether it's at the custodian or at the RIA. And I say that, my level of respect for them far exceeds my level of respect even for myself at times, because I know I couldn't handle it. I don't have the patience for it. And these are the unsung heroes of our industry, keeping these transactions moving.
Yeah, fair, totally fair. And I've met some of those individuals.
I bet you have, yeah.
Yeah, and I totally agree your sentiment there. But moving away from money and transitions and recruitment, I know you were at the NewEdge event last month, and you were at Schwab Impact. What are the conversations that you're hearing in the hallways that haven't yet made it to the main stage? What are people talking about?
Great question. I think everyone's kind of, if I think about the kind of the recruiters conference I went to, and so that was mostly recruiters and consultants like me. And, I'll obviously protect the innocent, as far as like who said what and different things. But I do think, the things that I mentioned earlier about the talent challenge is on people's mind. I do think, people are very bullish about advisors and movement, still, believing there's still plenty of advisors out there in non-RIA models that are exploring and thinking about these things. I still end up meeting with them. Last Monday I had a meeting with an advisor who's exploring his options. And it was interesting to me. I said, hey, well, who are you looking at? He had a list of 11. And I was like, whew, that's quite a bit. I recognized probably 4 out of them, but it just goes to show, and I work in this every day, right? I'm talking to people doing this every day, that there are these new players left and right. And maybe they're not even new players. They're old players that are dipping their toe into this space or doing different things in here. I feel excited for the advisor's opportunity, but I also feel a little worried that, Baskin Robbins went from 36 flavors to 3,600 flavors, right? And how are they going to make that decision?
That is true. Coming back to Foresight, Andy, it's almost a year now, come July?
Yeah, in July 4th, so a little over a month.
I know. What sort of discussions are you seeing yourself getting pulled into mostly?
Well, I've been very fortunate. I haven't really done much marketing myself out there, but I like to joke. I think I said to you, and I've said this to others, I'm monetizing 27 years of goodwill, right? So a lot of the engagements that I'm having are former clients of mine in various past lives I've had, which is honestly one of the more humbling experiences about launching a business.
Yeah.
Somebody that you either sold something to or worked with in the past finds you and wants to engage with you again. It's kind of why I do it. I'm a bit of an idealist out there. I have this kind of ideal view of the world. So that's been great. Where it's been going, it's all over the place. I have like my core clients, what I call kind of my, regular RIAs, meaning that they're out there, they're doing business, they're serving their clients, they're growing organically. They have the standard business issues like, do I need a COO? Do I need to move the CSM up into advisor? That sort of thing. Then you have kind of the more transactional recruiting and things like that. And that brings up all sorts of different conversations like, I'm based here in X city. I want to have an office in Jackson Hole. I'm like, well, so do I, right? But what's the business plan behind it, right?
Got it.
How that kind of thing. So it's all over.
No, sounds good. So if you're, I think, if you're an RIA watching this episode and that's a box you tick, then you should be calling Andy. I guess, Andy, this has been amazing. I know we touched upon several threads there. And learned a lot, like always. So thanks once again for being on the show.
Well, thank you. Great. And I appreciate our partnership and the work that you guys are doing out there. So keep it up. And I look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Bye.